And so the scraping begins. I have to work my way down through the many layers of varnish on that mast. And the scraping is followed by the sanding. And I'll strip it all the way back to bare wood, everywhere except for those anti-chafe bands, which are West epoxy and fiberglass roving. I'll leave those be and just varnish them. So I'm going to mix it up this time, pardon the pun. Before I apply varnish, I'm going to start off with some penetrating epoxy. And I've decided to use the mast epoxy, which is a very thin epoxy which is made to penetrate deeply into wood. And I'm going to give it even more penetrating power by adding about another 50% in volume of denatured alcohol to the mixed epoxy. And that thins it down pretty much to the same viscosity as water. The hope is that the epoxy base will increase the longevity of the varnish, as well as make the mast more rot resistant, and also toughen the surface of the wood and make it less prone to getting nicks and dings from flogging stay-sail cringles, for example. So I think I have this one successfully brazed here. This is the tang that goes to the throat halyard. And what was happening is the hole in the tang was getting wider and wider because the shackle pin was just chafing away at it, wearing away at it. So essentially I sleeved it with some bronze tubing. It's brass actually. And then braze/silver soldered it in. So this one's going to be a little more difficult because this goes to the stay-sail halyard, and you can see this is really ovaled from the wear. So we'll see what we can do about that. So I put this together with an extra little bit of brass in there, and then the white stuff is the flux paste. So your silver solder should run wherever that paste is. So now I got to apply some heat. So from what I learned out of YouTube University is that you want to start off by just generally warming the pieces of metal you're working on up first. Don't really go at it with the heat until it's had a chance to warm. The next thing I found is that you really have to get the flame just right on it and get it hot before the silver solder brazing stick will begin to run. And just like with electrical soldering, you need to get the piece you're working on hot enough to melt the solder. If you just drip liquefied solder onto it, you will not get a good bond. Now we gotta just let that cool a bit. That's still wicked hot. Okay, so here's what it looks like after we clean it up a bit here. So I didn't quite get all the gaps filled with the silver solder, but it should be strong enough to hold it in place. Remember, this is an anti-chafe measure, so it's not really a structural. It's not taking any kind of structural loading. It just has to hold the sleeve in place. So back to the dinghy. I have the 2 rubrail strakes cut to size. So now I want to apply some penetrating epoxy, which hopefully will prevent them from rotting, as the previous ones had done. And I'm going to bed the rail on 5200, which is also an adhesive. So it'll be attached from by wood screws from the inside, screwed in from the inside, and then also just the bonding power, the 5200. I'm applying those clamps and wood screws with some trepidation, especially up near the bow where the curve is kind of tight. Just worried that the wooden rub rail is going to crack. But it turns out it bent to shape just fine. As I said in the previous video, before I put the canvas rubber rail back on, I want to paint the new rub rail, and especially get paint on the underside, as when the dinghy is overturned on the foredeck, where it is stowed for offshore, for when I go offshore. I want to have something to block the UV from getting onto the epoxy, as ultraviolet light will degrade epoxy after a while. So finally putting the canvas rail back on, and I have to drill new holes where it screws into the new rub rail. So it's a little bit of a tedious job. Now for the final cherry on top, to add the leather that goes up forward where there's quite a bit of wear and chafe. Starting to look like a proper yacht tender. And now I pivot back to some interior projects. One is to replace the wood paneling, which is actually called the ceiling on boats, behind my portside bookshelf. And those are cedar strips, but they were getting old, and I find soft wood when it gets old gets sort of this fur on it. So anyway, I've decided to replace those with some new aromatic cedar. I'll take the opportunity to vacuum things out first. That freshly cut cedar has a pinkish color, and it has a very strong scent. And it's a very nice scent. It smells like the cabin now smells like a pine forest. As the ultraviolet light gets on it, though, it'll turn more of a light brown color after a while. Now all we got to do is add the books. That 44-pound galvanized spade anchor is the best anchor I've ever used or owned, period. However, like any other piece of galvanized steel on a boat, after a while the galvanized coating wears off and it begins to rust. So I'll go at it with a wire brush, try to get most of the rust off, and then spray paint it with Rust-Oleum, which is not going to last too long, but It'll keep the rust back for a little while.